Amnesia: The Dark Descent is a survival horror game made by Frictional Games. I've previously analyzed their first series of games, Penumbra, and now I'll be speaking of Amnesia, their most well-known creation. Amnesia is very similar to Penumbra. It builds upon what Penumbra did, and so I'll be frequently using Penumbra as a point of comparison to examine and illustrate improvements. That doesn't mean watching my 4-hour essay on Penumbra is necessary, though. I'll tell you what you need to know. Amnesia is a horror game, and as such my analysis will be primarily about the horror aspect, how it instills fear in you, and if and why it succeeds. That is the goal of this creation, after all, effectively stated when you first launch the game. Amnesia should not be played to win. Instead, you should try to immerse yourself in the story and world. I will not be criticizing the entertainment value of the gameplay. Instead, I will be examining how well the gameplay lends itself to horror and immersion. To put it simply, it's less about what you're doing and more about what you're feeling. This is not an evaluation of a product. This is an analysis of the potency of an experience. I won't speak of anything related to the game's story because I have no comment on it, surprisingly. It's by no means a bad story. I simply struggle to find anything to say at the moment. Maybe I'll make a separate video discussing the story if I actually have anything to say. This means the only spoilers are for game mechanics and certain enemy encounters, which is still quite critical information in a horror game. Therefore, if you're interested in the game, you should play it before watching this. Amnesia: The Dark Descent continues using a similar gameplay formula to that of Penumbra. The game comprises 4 different hub areas. These hub areas have rooms attached to them, points of interest as I referred to them in Penumbra. You freely visit all of them in any order you choose, and complete gameplay tasks to be able to progress to the next hub area. And in between these hub areas there are linear sections of differing lengths and contents. So largely the same formula as in Penumbra: Black Plague. However, whereas in Penumbra the hub areas were essentially big mazes with enemies patrolling them, in Amnesia the hub areas are very small, essentially singular rooms, and don't have any enemies, thus acting as safe rooms in a way. The use of enemies in this game is much more controlled. There aren't any permanently placed enemies patrolling certain areas at all. Essentially all enemy encounters are scripted to happen at certain moments. This ends up working to the game's benefit, but more on that in a moment. So, Amnesia does technically follow the general guidelines of the formula set in Penumbra. However, it cannot be considered nearly as formulaic as Penumbra. It doesn't feel as formulaic at all, which is good. Both the hub areas and linear sections are much more varied and protean in appearance and contents. For example, the first linear section between the first and second hub areas is a relatively short enemy encounter, but then the next linear section between the second and third hub areas is an hour of gameplay, containing puzzles and the majority of the game's enemy encounters. Amnesia is much harder to define and cut down into separate chunks and put into neat little boxes. It is less predictable, less knowable. H.P. Lovecraft is quoted saying, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Also, I'm afraid of black people. Frictional Games' clear understanding of this concept is a core reason why Amnesia: The Dark Descent is such a great horror experience. The unknown is present in not just the story, but the mechanics as well. The usage of the threats, the enemies in this game, is quite minimal, and this is a major strength of the game, as when it comes to horror, less is more. Humans tend to be most afraid of what's not there, of what they don't see. The first hub area doesn't have any enemies or threats at all, apart from minor environmental hazards that you walk around, these flesh growths. It took me around 2 hours of gameplay to reach the very first enemy encounter of the game. Those first 2 hours, the first hub area, serves to build up the tension and atmosphere. From the moment you start the game, you're going to be anticipating that moment when you finally meet something that wants to kill you. In this game, that tension is utilized for quite a long time, and to no detriment. It would be foolish to blow your load too early, when you can edge the introduction of the enemies and make sure the tension builds up as high as possible before the release. Even once you get to this first enemy encounter, it's not even a standard humanoid threat, it's the water monster. an enemy that's physical form goes completely unseen. The best part about the water monster is the sound. When you jump on the boxes, it will sense the vibrations and come to your location, but rather slowly. The at first slow movement can give you a false sense of security, however once you enter the water it speeds up, as is immediately made apparent by the hastened splashing sounds. One interesting detail is that at times when you try to jump on top of a box, you simply won't make it for some reason. I'm not sure if this is some jank related to your character's physics, or perhaps something intentional, but either way this is actually good jank, as it made me piss myself, and it didn't happen consistently enough to actually get me killed.
Haista vittu oikeasti, haista paska. Sometimes he doesn't fucking jump.
This water monster is only used during this one section, after which it is never seen again. However, later on in the game there are 2 areas which are also flooded with water. The flooded rooms will inevitably remind you of the water monster section, and so you'll be anticipating the monster to be used again. But it never happens. The ambient background track is calmer. It isn't the same intense one that played during the water monster encounter, but you don't trust this sense of security. At least I didn't. By previously creating a connection in the player's mind between water and a monster, the game can now create tension and instill anxiety in the player by simply putting them in a room with water in it, without needing there to be any actual threat at all. This is inherently better than if they actually did reuse the water monster again. When I saw a room flooded with water, I was expecting that the water monster would be there. If my expectations were proven true, that would have cut off and ruined the tension and anticipation of thinking, is it going to be used again? Am I safe to enter the water or not? Inevitably, the water monster would not have been as scary if it was used a second time. Only once I hit 3 hours of gameplay did I encounter the first humanoid pursuing enemy, a grunt. But even before this, there are at least 2 instances where the game shows you the sight of a grunt from afar, which, upon investigating, is actually nowhere to be seen. It's a fake-out. But of course the player doesn't know that, so you're left unsure of if those sightings were real or not. It made me feel like I couldn't trust my own eyes. I couldn't trust the game. One good detail is that during one of these fake-outs, the hint pop-up shows up telling you how stealth works, which of course makes you think that the enemy is in fact real and that you have to hide. Your first humanoid enemy encounter will be in the second hub area, with one of 2 different grunts depending on what order you explore the rooms in. In one encounter, you hide from it in a closet, and in the other, you stumble upon the grunt in a dark room. These encounters are effective. In the former, the room the encounter takes place in is a fully lit room with calm ambient music. It doesn't at all seem like the place for a monster encounter, but then a grunt barges in and you have to hide. It lulls you into a false sense of security. The other encounter is something quite unique. Instead of the monster and its sound approaching you, you simply naturally stumble upon the monster, as it's just standing in a dark room. This too caught me completely off guard. So commendably, regardless of which encounter you experience first, they are both good. By my count, there are 16 enemy encounters in this game, across 13 hours of gameplay. I made a chart that shows how many enemy encounters there are in each hour of the game. The main purpose of this is to make me seem smarter than I actually am. Like, come on. But also, it visually shows that the enemy encounters are paced in such a way that there is a steady build-up until it reaches a sort of climax. Then it has a little downtime until it spikes again before dying down. The encounters are dispersed evenly enough throughout the game. There aren't too many at any one point, although they do lean a bit on the edge. The most it reached was 4, and I would say that 5 encounters in 1 hour would have begun to be too much. One important factor, though, is that all the enemy encounters in this game are usually quite brief. The enemies always disappear when you hide and escape them. They have no permanent placement, except for maybe one near the end of the game that I'm unsure of. The enemies also disappear when you die. This is good. It removes the possibility of you getting stuck on a section and thus getting frustrated instead of scared. Death in a horror game ends the horror. It cuts off any tension. It interrupts the entire experience. Therefore, you don't want your players to be constantly dying. By allowing the player to progress regardless of whether they die or not, the game makes your death part of the experience instead of an interruption. This is also helped by the unique death screen. It doesn't say, "you died" or "game over." It either has some sort of hint, or it tells you to simply carry on. It also doesn't look like a loading screen. There's no loading icon, so it doesn't disturb immersion. The game never takes you out of the experience, even for a moment. All of these aforementioned things, they prevent overexposure to the enemies. The more you're exposed to an enemy in a horror game, the more you get used to it, and the less scary it becomes. You are most afraid of what's not there. Less is more. This is something Frictional Games already somewhat practiced and understood in Penumbra Black Plague, but in Amnesia they perfected it by removing permanently placed patrolling enemies and limiting the usage of the enemies to brief scripted encounters. I do see one slight fault in the enemy usage though. It's not in regards to the quantity of enemy encounters, but rather the type of encounters used. Most of them are unique, which is commendable, but one certain type of encounter is used quite a few times. It's a type of encounter I'll refer to as a dead-end encounter. It's when a monster appears upon you entering or completing a task in a room at the end of a corridor, or that otherwise counts as a dead end. This always has the same response. All you can do is retreat back to the dead end and hide. It was used enough times to the point that I started to notice it. 6 times to be exact. It isn't anything major. Most of the other enemy encounters are still varied. But they could have come up with a few more unique encounters instead of repeating this dead-end gimmick. The player will stop being scared by the same scenario when it occurs repeatedly. Now about the mechanics of the game, the first being darkness. The darkness in Amnesia is true darkness. Unlit areas appear as a pitch-black void to a player standing in the light, so the only way to see what lurks in it is to enter it, upon which your eyes adjust to the dark. Unlike some horror games where darkness only serves as an atmospheric element, Amnesia gives the darkness a function. It gives the player a mechanical reason to avoid the darkness, that being the sanity mechanic. Being in the dark with no light drains your sanity. Lighting up areas will cost you either lamp oil or tinder boxes. And the lamp actually burns through oil quite quickly, which is an improvement over the Penumbra games where you never had to worry about your flashlight running out of battery due to its slow draining. And even if it was possible to run out of light sources in Penumbra, it wouldn't mean anything because the darkness didn't do anything to you. In Amnesia, it does. What does it do? Well, the game never actually tells the player what exactly will happen if they lose too much sanity. The tutorial simply tells you to avoid it, but not why. This is good. By leaving it vague, you'll be led to suspect the worst. You certainly won't want to find out what'll happen, because for all you know it could result in death, which would be correct if you're playing on the highest difficulty. By depriving the player of concrete information such as, was that monster I just saw even real? And why do I have to avoid losing sanity in the dark? The game lets your mind fill in the blanks. Another example of this information deprivation is that, unlike Penumbra, Amnesia has no maps. There's not a single map in the entire game. It is entirely up to you to get a lay of the land. The levels aren't terribly complicated or big, so it's not like you're gonna get lost, but it still makes you just that much less comfortable in the environment. Another important thing is that using light sources will also cost you the cover of darkness. In order to hide from enemies, you have to be in the darkness, despite it draining your sanity. This juxtaposition results in anxiety whenever you're hiding from an enemy. You're constantly reminded by crackling sound effects of your waning sanity. However, this isn't utilized as well as it could be, at least not in the main game. There is, however, a short expansion called Amnesia Justine. It had a terrifying section where an enemy patrolled an area and wouldn't disappear, so you had to sneak past it. It was also quite a challenging segment as the window of time to get past the enemy was tight. This section successfully caused me immense anxiety, having to carefully observe the enemy from afar to judge when it's safe to sneak past, while being constantly disturbed by the effects of your waning sanity, hearing the crackling sound effects and eventually even collapsing and losing control, which is the most detrimental effect of sanity loss. It's amazing. It's a shame the main game didn't have any encounter like this. There was one encounter where you had to sneak past an enemy, but it wasn't in the darkness. Regardless, you did still have to hide in every other encounter in the main game. It's just that you never had to hide in the darkness long enough for sanity to become an issue. However, this is mended by the fact that the exact value of your sanity is not displayed. There are simply 4 different thresholds that give you a general idea of how low it is. The same applies to your health. This is something they already understood in Penumbra as well. Again, this lack of information is good because it leaves the player unsure. It makes sure they'll never be exactly comfortable. And with that, I've actually said my piece. Didn't need 4 hours for this one. In conclusion, with Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Frictional Games took what they did in Penumbra and essentially perfected it. They fixed every issue I had with Penumbra, so what more can I say? It's the best horror game I've ever played. I spent the entire game crouch walking through the dark hallways, so fearful of the nature of the monsters and the functions of the sanity mechanic, the nature of the game in general, because I was so perfectly unknowing of it all.